Okay. Hello, everyone. I guess just good afternoon, since we're starting right after noon. It's wonderful to see everybody. Hi, my name is Ben, and I am the Chief Planning Officer at the Jewish Federation of Greater Metrowest, New Jersey. And I'm really glad to be here with all of you. I am a new member of the Greater Metrowest community and the Federation team. I started my position there back in August. It's been a wonderful first few months for me, meeting lots of incredible people, colleagues, and people out in the community. I've actually, this session is geared towards JCCs, and I've been out to the JCC Metrowest. I'm looking forward to getting to the JCC in Central and to the Union Y in the days and weeks ahead. Moment for me to join the Greater Metrowest Jewish community, because it's right at this moment where we are rolling out and looking into the 2020 Jewish Community Study. The purpose of our community study is to provide the Greater Metrowest Jewish community with reliable information to help all of us, those of us who are working at the Federation, across the whole community, but also all of you who work in the community, to better fulfill our mission, to care for people in need and to build a vibrant Jewish community. This is the first time we've collected this sort of data in the Greater Metrowest Jewish community in over 20 years. And so it's really great that a couple of years ago, the Federation leadership invested in this study. They engaged the Maurice and Marilyn Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University, which is a multidisciplinary research institute dedicated to the study of American Jewry and religious and cultural identity, to do the study for us. And so we're really grateful to have partnered with the Cohen Center experts in this sort of communal research. The community study was released just a few weeks ago, and you can, if you haven't already, you can access all of the reports on the Federation website. And we've invited you here today to be a part of the conversation about what the data that we found looks like and what it all means. We're really pleased that Janet Aronson, the lead researcher of our community study, is here with us today. In a few moments, she's going to share a presentation of how she did it with her team, what the community study, sort of methods were about, and then share a number of key findings across the whole community, but also some selected especially that we think will be of interest to folks who work in the space of JCCs. And then after Janet's presentation, there'll be the opportunity for you to ask some questions and Janet to be able to answer them. So let me sort of introduce Janet more formally. Janet Aronson is the director of the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University. She earned her PhD in social policy at the Heller School for Social Policy at Brandeis. Janet's directed and contributed to local Jewish community studies in over a dozen communities, recently released study of the Jewish community in Chicago, and the most recent one of here in Greater Metrowest. And Janet is especially happy to have learned about her home community, because Janet grew up in Metrowest. She grew up in Union County, where she was a student at what was then called the Solomon Schechter Day School of Essex and Union, and we now know as the Goldock Academy. So it's been really great to welcome Janet back home, as it were, to share the findings of this community study with all of us. And without further ado, turning it over to Janet.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And I'll just add to Ben's introduction that in case your memories don't go back that far, when I lived in Union and I went to Schechter, it was upstairs on the Green Lane Y. So I have fond memories of that building. It was not quite as luxurious as the Goldock Academy is, but it was a very intimate place to go to school. So I do remember it fondly. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and take you through some of the data from the report. Because of this particular group, I have a kind of smattering of information on a variety of topics that I think will be relevant to the JCC and Y community and staff. There's a lot more in the report, so I encourage you to read them, and we can talk about them later, what is in there. But this is just some highlights for you to be aware of the extent of the information that is available to you. So first, I want to just frame the study a little bit, talk about how to think about it, a couple of words about how we did the study, and then present some of the key findings generally about the study, as well as specific to the JCC and Y interests. As you read the study, as you read the reports, there's the Federation website has the reports on it. There is an overview report, as well as set of topic specific reports. You may want to look at some or all that are of interest. As you look at them, one thing that's important to mind is that the data in these reports is based on a survey. We obviously could not ask everybody in Greater Metro West how they their answers to the questions. So the idea of a survey is you ask a sample of people that's scientifically selected and invited to do the survey, and then you use that those to estimate what would the response be is if you had asked everybody. So these numbers are all estimates, and if you're familiar, as many people are, with election surveys, election polls, where there's always a margin of error, it's also the case in these numbers. It's really plus or minus. And what that really means is that when two numbers are close together, there may not be a real difference between them, and it's just the estimates came out a little bit different. So I encourage you to focus on big differences between the numbers, and also, rather than getting hung up on the exact numbers, what's really interesting is to look at the patterns and say, what's different about people of different ages and people who live in different parts of the area. So that should be the focus as you review the reports. How did we do it? We got responses from almost 3,300 Jewish households in Greater Metro West. That's a large number, and it allows us to do some subgroup analysis to drill down into responses by different groups. I assure you we will not be able to drill down as much as everybody wants, but we've tried to do it as much as we can. One thing that is important to keep in mind to contextualize the findings is that we collected data a year ago between October and December of 2020. We thought by now COVID would be behind us, but certainly then COVID was really an active, it was important to consider both in terms of how it affected Jewish behavior, how it affected economic well-being, and people's concerns about politics and racism, and there are all sorts of things, and we tried to incorporate those into the study, and I'll mention those where it's relevant, but there is more about that in the reports itself. Let's start with the sort of number one question: how big is the Greater Metro West Jewish community? And you can see on the slide there are a lot of numbers that answer that question. I'll start with the number on top. Over 122,000 Jewish people live in Greater Metro West, and they live in almost 57,000 households. A Jewish person, I'll define in a moment, but a household is a group of people who live together with at least one Jewish adult. Obviously, not everybody in Jewish households is Jewish. So when you think about, I'd say, the broadest definition of the community, I would think about this number: 155,000 individuals live in Jewish households in Greater Metro West. And I have these divided between children and adults, Jewish and non-Jewish. Jewish adults, for the purposes of the study, are defined as people who identify as Jewish. There could be as their religion, it could be culturally, ethnically. It could be that they identified as Jewish and another religion. In addition, they need some sort of Jewish background characteristic, which we include having at least one Jewish parent, being raised Jewish, or converted to Judaism. For children, it's as long as they are considered Jewish by their parents, we consider them Jewish as well. Now a look at the region, and this is defined as the catchment area of the Federation. And you can see it's mostly divided by counties. So here we have Union County, Essex County, the eastern part of Morris County. It's the majority of Morris County. And then we have Sussex and the rest of Morris and a little bit of Somerset County. And just because it's, you may be wondering this, the reason why we had to divide Morris County is because we need to have enough households and enough respondents in each region to be able to analyze them and tell you anything about those regions. So because this pink area, the Western Greater Metrowest, is much less dense Jewish population, we kind of had to move the line and take some of the Western Morris County people and include them. And I think, also thinking about it, that there are really differences in the county, that the eastern part and western part have really different characteristics. So you can see that the largest share of Jewish households are in Essex County, that's 38%. The next largest is Eastern Morris County, that's a quarter. And about the same share, 19% are in Union County, and then all of this Western Greater Metro West. Some information about the households in the county, in the area, and 80% of about 3/4 of households include a couple. That could be married, partnered couples who live together. Of those, about half are unmarried and about half are intermarried. Just thinking about Jewish children, also about the same number of children are being raised by unmarried and intermarried families, and then parents, and then about 8% are being raised by single parents. In terms of income and standard of living, we asked a lot of questions to try to identify economic financial need. This is just a subset of them, but sort of the basic questions. We asked both income and how do you describe your standard of living. You can see that about 5% of households are based on their income and the size of their household. They are under 250% of the federal poverty level. About a quarter of households don't answer the question. That's pretty typical. So that's one of the values of this other question, just describe how you describe yourself. These were the responses that we offered. And these two financially struggling categories, 2% say they cannot make ends meet, 15% say they're just managing to make ends meet. And so we combine those two categories, that's 17%, and describe those as financially struggling. And we refer to those a great deal in the report and talk about their characteristics. Just looking at the how the regions look in terms of composition, there's a little bit of difference, not huge. In Essex, about 1/3 of households have children at home. Minor children are age 17 and younger. About 1/4 in Union, 30% in East Morris, and 1/4 in Western Greater Metro West. There's not a huge difference here. Then I want to talk about some other demographic groups, just as you should be aware of. And these are groups that we specifically looked at. And we found that 5% of Jewish adults grew up in a Russian-speaking home. This is a group that's often called Russian-speaking Jews, but they may or may not speak Russian. And 6% of Jewish adults are Israeli citizens. 4% identify as LGBTQ. 4% identify as a race other than white, or they may define themselves as Hispanic. And this number on the right shows the number of households that include someone with that identity. And in some cases, it's larger because it may include non-Jewish people in those households. Just some numbers. I showed you the overall numbers, and I just want to break down children because I know that may be particularly important because we looked at percents, but you can see that by far the majority of Jewish children live in Essex County, followed by East Morris, and about the same number in Union and Western Greater Metro West. And now age, because I know that there may be interest among seniors and older people. So this is just the age distribution of senior adults. This is not by region. We don't have enough. But you can see that overall there are 28,000 Jewish adults who are age 65 and older in the whole catchment area. And this just shows how they're divided by age. And there are a smaller number of non-Jewish seniors. Where do they live? fairly evenly distributed across all of the regions. Just to summarize there. Okay, so that's the overview demographic snapshot. I'm going to turn now to a little information about Jewish engagement. Most people are most familiar with Jewish denominations as a way to measure Jewish engagement. And here we can see the percent of Jewish adults who identify with each Jewish denomination. Now, note that this is different than synagogue membership. This is just what is your denomination. This on the right is US Jewish adults. This comes from a recent Pew study. There are some differences, not huge. One of the most important trends in understanding Jewish denominations in the United States is the growing share who don't identify with a specific denomination. So here that's 38% of Greater Metrowest Jewish adults. It's about the same as the national numbers. Half of that group describes themselves as secular or culturally Jewish, and half of them describe themselves as just Jewish. I'm going to be talking about in a few moments a way to understand that, but it's important to understand that this does not necessarily mean disengaged from Jewish life. We have another way of understanding Jewish engagement that we've developed for this study. It looks at a set of about 20 Jewish behaviors, things that people do, and not just ritual behaviors. It includes that, attending services, lighting Shabbat candles. It also includes organizational activities like belonging to a synagogue, belonging to a Jewish organization, donating to Jewish organizations. And then it includes personal activities, individual activities, things like reading Jewish books and talking about Jewish topics with your friends. And if we take all of those behaviors and put them together and kind of analyze them statistically, we've identified 5 patterns of Jewish behavior. And that's what this model presents. And we can see that about 16% of Jewish adults are minimally involved. That means they do very little of these 20 behaviors. They don't do very many of them. About the same size, 14% are what we call immersed. They do all of the behaviors. In between, we have 3 categories. I think the most interesting, which is about a quarter of the population for each. The familial group, we call them familial because the main things that they do are what we call the family holidays. That's Hanukkah, appropriate now, and having a Passover Seder. And we call those families because people do those at home. They don't have to belong to a synagogue. And those are the most widely practiced Jewish rituals in the United States. Then there's another group, also about a quarter, we call it personal. And those are the people who most of their Jewish life is practiced at home individually. And those are the cultural activities, eating Jewish foods, following news about Israel, things that they can do at home without any being involved with an organization. So I think that these are really interesting groups to kind of keep an eye on. And just to kind of emphasize the point is, how is this different than denomination? I mentioned that group, it was 38% of people who have no denomination. Well, it turns out of that no denomination group, a quarter of them are minimally involved, but the rest, the other 3/4 are in all of these other engagement groups, that they are engaged in Jewish life in a variety of ways. Synagogues, just mentioned that briefly, about, let's see, 29% of households include a synagogue member. And this just breaks down the types of synagogues, the denomination of synagogue member household, what denomination are they in? And this share is about the same as the national average. Okay, now I'm going to move on to Jewish organizations and focusing on JCCs and Ys. 4% of all households are members of JCC or a Y. The number, not surprisingly, is a little higher in Essex and Union and much lower in the other areas. The we also asked about other kinds of memberships, other formal Jewish organizations. That includes things like Hadassah, that type of organization, and then informal Jewish groups, which might be things like a Jewish book club or a kind of social chabara, things like that. And you can see that a much larger share belong to other kinds of organizations, also not surprising. What is also not surprising but noteworthy is that membership in organizations is much higher among older people. We see how high it is among people who are 75 plus, and relatively high among 65 and older, and much lower among younger people. This again matches a trend, national trend, about participating in organizations but not choosing to belong. I talked about the Jewish engagement groups. Here we see that those lower engagement groups, and I think the familial is really interesting. They're the ones who I said they do the holidays, Passover and Hanukkah. They belong, some of them belong to the JCC, but they don't belong to other organizations. These other engagement groups belong to all kinds of organizations. Now I'm going to look at a range of information we have about activities, and this is all measured over the past year, and we included both in-person and online activities. So that's an interesting trend, and we have that broken down a little bit. But you can see about, it's easier to look at this never column. Almost half of people did not do any programs at all in the last year. And this is the share who did not volunteer, not a leader. And then we asked about searching for Jewish resources and information that's online, and using social media to communicate. So that's, these are growing trends, but it's not a large proportion of the community. For people who went to programs, we asked where were those programs, and you can see that the largest share went to programs sponsored by a synagogue. This is aside from services. 9, 10, 11% went to a JCC or Federation-sponsored program, 9% to a Chabad program, and about 6% went to a Jewish political organization, which could have been like AIPAC or things like that. And now in terms of the types of programs, and I think this is interesting and showing, we always believe that the best predictor of what people will do is what they have already done. This shows what they're interested in. So this shows the types of programs that they've gone to. The largest interest is in educational programs. So, I mean, it's actually all very similar. Education, social, charitable, religious, this was aside from services, and cultural. And you can see there's interest in all of these types of programs. In the report, we look at how does the difference vary among different groups. Now I'm going to turn on to just feelings about being connected to the community. So we asked a question, how satisfied are you with your current level of connection to the Jewish community? And you could see that most people are pretty satisfied. 20% say they're not satisfied. Most of them are pretty satisfied with what they're doing so far. You can see here that people, the more engaged they are, the more satisfied they are with their level of connection. Then we ask for people who are not satisfied. They say, this is really an more important question. What are the barriers to participating in Jewish life as much as you would like? And this is going from the bottom to the top. So this group down at the bottom, about 2/3, I'm just adding up all these blues, 2/3 said, haven't found Jewish activities is one of the biggest barriers to participation. About a similar number said the coronavirus crisis, not surprising. The other ones that people mentioned, I mean, this was from a list, they chose from a list, don't know many Jewish people, not confident in their Jewish knowledge, feeling unwelcome, political views unwelcome, safety or security concerns was one of the lower ones. And now, again, I'm skipping a lot of parts of the report that I'm just trying to present to you. It's a bit of a hodgepodge, but it's just really to give you a flavor of what kind of information is available. And we found that 30% of Jewish children under age 5 or 5 and under are enrolled in Jewish preschool. That, I should tell you, compared to other communities, is a relatively high number. 20% are in part-time school. We cannot tell how much that number was affected by the COVID. 7% are in day school. And then we asked about a number of other kinds of Jewish informal education. 15% of children went to a Jewish overnight camp. 7% went to a Jewish day camp. For those we asked about 2019 or 2020, because obviously in 2020, there wasn't much happening. And now in the last topic, I want to turn briefly to social service needs. We found that 19% of Jewish households includes at least one person with a chronic health issue, special need, or disability that limits their daily activities. And of course, not surprisingly, older Jewish adults have higher rates of these conditions. Of the households where someone had the condition, about almost half of them said it was a chronic illness was the condition that limited their lives, followed by physical disability. Of these households who said that they had a health issue, 43% said that they received all the services that they needed. About a quarter said they did not receive some service that they needed, and about a third said they did not receive any services. And this just compares it with people who are older. So you can see, for example, here, of people who are 75 and older, more than half said they received all the services that they needed. So just have that. And then we asked about where you got your services from, a Jewish or a non-Jewish organization. 9% said they received services from a Jewish organization. 2% said that they sought services from a Jewish organization but did not get what they needed. And the vast majority, 89%, said they only sought services from non-Jewish organizations. And that is what I have for you today, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Janet. I really appreciate you walking us through all of that data. You can all see that there's a ton of interesting information about our community in the community study. And what we want to do now is give you the opportunity to ask some questions. We're going to collect those questions in the chat. So feel free to just put questions in the chat. You can start writing them right now and directing them to us, and then we can, and I'll sort of moderate and bring the questions to Janet for her to be able to respond. While you're writing your questions, a word about those questions. So please do ask questions about anything Janet presented today, any of the slides she shared, or the particular findings from the report. Also, if you've been reading the community study reports on the Federation website, feel free to ask questions about any part of the report. It's especially helpful if you're able to direct us to, a particular section of the report you're asking about. Anything about the methodology that Janet went over, or any of the data points she shared, those are ready to answer those questions. And also, as great as Janet is at answering our questions about these reports and presenting all the data that her team collected, it's a massive data set, and we do not expect Janet to have put the entire data set to memory. So, questions that say to her, well, can you tell me this specific data point from the data set without having a reference to report it to one of her slides, probably won't get us to the type of answers we're looking for. So so again, questions about anything Janet presented, or anything in the reports that you've seen would be great, and we'll have those come through the chat. So please do type them in now. While we're waiting, Janet, for the questions to come through, I know you mentioned it up at the top about how to think about this data, but I know that in some of our other information sessions, questions about particular subsets of of the community have come up. And maybe you could say a word about both, how granular we can really get, but also what some of the power of the report is in terms of the cross-tabulating and, looking across subgroups.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I think those are great framing questions. I think that, as I mentioned up front, the power is in what we call the cross tabulations. That's the many tables in the report that show how do these numbers differ between the different subgroups that we've identified, whether it's region or age or economic status. One thing to note is that in the report, we've shaded the numbers where there is a statistically significant difference. That means we are fairly, even if, as I said, the numbers might not be exactly precise, everyone, but we are fairly confident that there's a real difference in the population. It's not just because of the numbers, the random chance of the numbers. So pay attention to that where you see a difference. And then this next step goes, why is there a difference? Why are people in the different, it's an easy one. And when it comes to JCC, why membership, why are people in different regions joining at the JCCs at different rates? Well, that's an easy one when you can see that in the data. But, other questions about participation in programs and why does that vary? And the idea is to sort of give you a picture of who are the different constituents in the community. What are the different subgroups? Now, there are some groups that we would love to be able to say more about. In some cases, we'll plan to do further analysis and break them down a little bit more. In some cases, we won't be able to, and that's based on the actual number of respondents in the survey. So for example, one that I think there's a lot of interest in is families with young children, preschool age children. We'll be able to give a little more information, but it's just are not that many actual respondents in the survey with preschool age children. So even though we can estimate their characteristics, we can't break them down by where they live, and we can't, there's only so many ways you can kind of slice and dice the same numbers. There's some things that we should be able to go more, like in some cases getting a little more granular on region, and especially where some of the regions are large that we could break down, and that's all part of the rollout. And I think Ben can speak to this about how, what the plans would be for going forward and learning more.
Thanks, Janet. Yeah, it's really helpful. And also, like to your point, it's we'll dig as deep as we can, but we are limited by the scope of the study. So we have a question here in the chat, and it refers to the index of Jewish engagement, in particular the folks in the familial category who are involved Jewishly in their homes with that. Well, I guess it could also be the personal category, either of those, without joining communal institutions. And the question is, was there any data gathered that could provide insight about barriers to participation? Why are 25% choosing not to participate in the community?
I'm going to unpack that question in two ways. So first of all, yes, the question that I presented later on about barriers to participating in Jewish life, that is all presented separately for these groups, so you can see how the barriers vary.
Is that in the
it's in the community connections report.
Community connections report.
Yeah, so read that one. I personally, I think that's the most interesting report. I'd start with that if I were you, if you haven't read other ones.
Again, and that all the reports are easily linked on our website, and the community connections one is a good one to just to find these answers. Sorry, go ahead, Janet.
Right, sure. And I think I'd really dig into that. And I think, for example, as Ben said, I don't always remember all the numbers, but I'm pretty sure that this is a finding. People who are more Jewishly engaged were more likely to say that the coronavirus was a barrier to participation. For people who are not so engaged, it wasn't a barrier because they didn't really want to participate. So it wasn't a particular problem for them. So that's the kind of thing that, you can dig into. And I think thinking about those barriers, really spending time digging into what those barriers are could be a really fruitful conversation. And I think I think that you should really also take the time to think about what they mean. So one example that I like to talk about a lot is we have a question there about, I don't feel comfortable with my Jewish knowledge. And I think it's important to understand, and we phrased it that way for a reason, and what people are saying with that. It does not mean I don't know enough to participate in this Jewish space. It means I don't feel comfortable with participating in this Jewish space at the level of knowledge I'm at now. So it is easy to make the mistake of thinking that the response to that barrier is we have to educate people. No, I think Jewish education is a great thing, and I think that's a good thing to do. But a better response, or another response, might be to make sure that Jewish spaces are comfortable for people who are not knowledgeable. So, this is a lot of organizations are doing that, being really careful about their use of Hebrew and references to sort of Jewish cultural touch points without any explanation. Because it's very easy when people are familiar with those to say, this is how, if I know the word Shabbat Shalom, wishing people good Shabbat, I feel really comfortable in a space where people say Shabbat Shalom. But how does that feel for someone who doesn't know what those words mean? So that's the intent of this Jewish knowledge barrier. In terms of the bigger question here about this, you're saying that the quarter of people in the familial and a quarter of people in personal are not engaged in Jewish life. I think I'd like to reframe that question to say they are engaged in Jewish life, but they're not engaged in communal Jewish life. And I think that, the whole Jewish world has to really think about what are the goals? Like what are your goals? If the end goal is that everybody should join a Jewish organization, I think frankly, that's going to be a kind of hard sell in this day and age. But if the end goal is to enrich Jewish life, then I would suggest that for people who are participating in Jewish life outside of organizations, the challenge is, how do you enhance Jewish life for people at home? What kind of resources do you send them at home? And now we have a great opportunity with online activities. What do you invite people to do from their homes that may be provided by organizations, but doesn't require the commitment joining? And I think that this is absolutely the trend in the Jewish world. It's the trend in the general world. Younger people do not commit. They do not join. They might join afterwards once they're connected and they say, this is a place I want to be, and then join, but they don't start by joining and say, okay, now what am I going to do? That's an older model. Now they say, what's the value here? And if I really like it, perhaps I'll join.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. And I appreciate your point about thinking about this index of Jewish engagement as a description of the ways that so many members of the Jewish community, even if they're not institutional members, are participating in Jewish life in various ways. So I see Joyce's question about next steps, but I'm going to hold off, Joyce, because I am going to sort of wrap up with what we're thinking about at Federation. So I want to just, if there are any other questions before that about the study data itself, and anything that Janet presented today. Okay, so so Joyce had put in there. That's a good. So that's one. Thanks, Joyce. That's one of the things that I've been sort of pitching up for Janet over and over again, which is about comparisons. So Janet, you want to say a word about that?
Sure. So in some cases in the report where it's available, we've done, we included comparisons to national averages. For example, on the denomination, I showed that to you today, on synagogue membership. Those national averages are all taken from the Pew study, which just came out. So these are pretty hot off the press. And we've included where there are appropriate comparisons. We don't always have them. Sometimes the question isn't worded the same way, or it's just not, Pew just didn't ask many of the things that we would like to ask. For example, there's a lot of interest in knowing about children participation in Jewish education, and everybody would like to know, how does that compare to national? Pew does not have that. There's no information on that. I am, because I have done so many of these studies, that's where I was able to tell you, it looks to me like your Jewish preschool enrollment is higher, but that is based on looking at a set of other communities. And we don't include comparisons to other communities in this report. Main reason is every community is so different from each other. Like, it's not fair to compare Greater Metrowest to Chicago. It's just so different in terms of the composition of the community and the geography of the community, and the fact that it's a city with a lot of young adults, and you are suburbs with a lot of families, and it just doesn't. It's really not an apples to apples comparison. But because I've looked at so many studies, some numbers really do jump out. And but you are welcome. All of our other community studies are available on the Cohen Center website, and you are more than welcome to look at them and see what we've learned about other communities. We also encourage federations to talk to each other and learn from each other.
Great, thanks, Janet. So look, Janet and her team have been great about when there are data that are comparable, making sure they're already in the reports, and you'll see them there. And as we've been asking follow-up questions, where they have a particular vantage point to be able to say this, well, we don't have a particular study about this, but we've looked at lots of communities, we can help with that. And that's, I think, a good segue to the follow-up work that Janet talked about and the question that Joyce put in the chat. So we see this as the beginning of a conversation, right? So we have the data now, we're looking at it, we're talking about it. Janet and I are meeting with lots of folks across the greater Metrowest community to help make sure everyone has access to it. And then the next step is to think about, what do we think the data means, and what might we do in response to it? And we are hoping that everyone in the Jewish community who is interested in strengthening our community for the future will be a part of that process. And that means, to respond directly to the question in the chat, yes, we think each agency should do its own thing within its own, sort of area of your mission, your part of the community that you're focused on, and think about, what are the pieces of this data that are useful to you? What questions do you still have that you might want to follow up on? And then we're from Federation's stance, we're not here to tell you, here's what you have to do. We want to be in thought partnership with you about what we can do together to strengthen the Jewish community. So open invitation. As you're doing this type of thinking, please be in touch with me. If you have follow-up questions, areas of the data you're not certain about, things you want to dig into further. As I go and meet with lots of people across the community, I'm actually gathering lots of different follow-up items. Janet said it before. Some of them we're going to be able to dig into and get answers to, and some of them we might not be able to, but we want to know what is on people's minds and what they want to learn more about, and we want to be in partnership with you as we really leverage this community study to all of our advantage. At Federation, we're doing the same thing. Our lay leaders and professionals are working in partnership with each other to look at what are the trends across the community study reports, and what areas might we identify, to prioritize for attention and exploration. And as we need time to do that work too, we're working on it. As we do that work together, across Federation, we'll be sharing out with you how it proceeds in the weeks and months ahead. So we'll be, doing the work for Federation from our vantage point. We hope you'll do the work in your JCCs and in the Y, thinking about how this data can be helpful to you. And again, please do be in touch with me as you do that work. Happy to help continue the conversation further. with no more questions sitting in the chat right now, I'm going to express gratitude. I want to thank everybody for partnering with us today. Thanks to Janet for sharing the information and answering our questions. Thanks for everybody for joining, and wishing everybody a happy Hanukkah, joyous holiday season, and a Shabbat Shalom. And thanks very much.